The first time I realized something was wrong with my chocolate cake recipe was on a Sunday afternoon. I had just taken the cake out of the oven, and the whole kitchen smelled like chocolate. My daughter was sitting at the table waiting for the first slice, and I was so proud that I was already certain it would be one of those cakes everyone would ask for the recipe for. Then I cut the first slice. On the outside, it looked perfect, but when the knife reached the center, I knew immediately. The cake was dry, crumbly, and much heavier than it should have been. My daughter tried to be kind and said it was good, but I knew that cake. I knew it wasn't. What bothered me was that I had done exactly what the recipe instructed. I measured everything, followed the temperature exactly, and didn't leave the cake in the oven for even a minute longer than recommended. And yet, something was wrong. It wasn't until a few days later, when I found an old note from my mother tucked inside one of my recipe books, that I began to understand what I had been doing differently. It was a small instruction I had never seen in modern recipes, and that little step completely changed the way I've made chocolate cake ever since. The most interesting part is that the problem wasn't the recipe itself. I was using perfectly ordinary ingredients, the same amount of cocoa I had always used, and the same oven that had been in my kitchen for years. What I didn't know was that the way you treat cocoa before it goes into the batter can make an enormous difference in the final result. My mother had learned this long before there were boxed mixes, recipe videos, and all those tools that seem indispensable today. And when I finally understood why she did that extra step, I realized it wasn't some complicated pastry chef trick. It was a simple, inexpensive, and almost forgotten technique. Today, I'm going to show you exactly how I make this cake, what that step is that changed my recipe, why it works, and which small mistakes can turn a perfectly soft cake into a dry one. Because after all these years of making chocolate cake, I can say one thing for certain: the secret isn't adding more chocolate. It's knowing what to do with it before you even start baking. My mother learned how to make this kind of cake at a small family bakery where she worked when she was young. It wasn't one of those modern bakeries filled with machines and prepared mixes. It was the kind of place where the same family did practically everything by hand, day after day, and many of the recipes had already been there for decades. Back then, bakers didn't have a shortcut for every step. They had to understand the ingredients. They knew when a batter needed more liquid, when the butter was at the right temperature, and, most importantly, what to do with the cocoa before mixing it with the flour. My mother used to say that the older bakers didn't need to think so much about following a recipe because they learned to recognize the batter. They could tell by the smell, the texture, and even the appearance when something was wrong. And it was by watching those people that she learned a small technique she continued using at home for decades. I grew up watching it happen, but I never paid much attention to it. To me, it was simply the way my mother made cake. It was only many years later, when I started comparing my recipes with hers, that I realized there was one very specific difference. I put the cocoa directly into the bowl with the dry ingredients. She didn't. And when I finally asked her why, her answer was so simple that it almost sounded absurd. She said, "You need to wake the chocolate up first." At the time, I didn't understand what that meant. Today, I understand exactly why that little step made such a big difference. For a long time, I thought the solution to a dry chocolate cake was obvious. Add more chocolate. More cocoa, more melted chocolate, more frosting. If the cake needed more flavor and seemed like it should be richer, then it seemed logical to simply add more. But there's a problem with that idea. Chocolate flavor and moisture are two different things. You can add a huge amount of cocoa to a batter and still end up with a dry cake. Cocoa can make the flavor more intense, but it also affects the structure of the batter. And if you simply keep adding dry ingredients without compensating for the liquid and fat in the recipe, you may end up taking away exactly the softness you were trying to achieve. That's why a cake can come out of the oven with a deep, dark color and an amazing smell, only to feel heavy and dry in your mouth a few minutes later. Flour, Cocoa, sugar, fat, eggs, and liquids aren't there just to provide flavor. Each one plays a different role in the batter. Flour and cocoa help create the structure. Liquids hydrate that structure. Fat contributes to tenderness. Sugar helps with texture and moisture retention. And baking time determines how much of that water remains in the cake. And that's where many people get confused. When a cake turns out dry, the usual reaction is to add something else. More butter, more chocolate, more milk. But the problem isn't always the quantity. Sometimes it's the way the ingredients are prepared before the batter even goes into the oven. That's what my mother had learned at that old bakery. And now we've reached the little step I spent years ignoring. The same one that can turn simple cocoa into one of the most important parts of a truly moist and intensely flavored chocolate cake. So, what exactly was my mother doing differently? She didn't put the cocoa directly into the bowl. First, she placed the cocoa in a small bowl and added very hot liquid. She stirred slowly until that dark powder turned into a smooth, glossy, incredibly aromatic paste. This technique has a name: cocoa blooming. And although it may seem like such a small step that it couldn't possibly change an entire cake, that's exactly where the secret lies. When cocoa comes into contact with a hot liquid, it hydrates and releases its flavor compounds much more easily. Instead of having tiny particles of cocoa simply dispersed throughout the batter, you start with a much more uniform and intense mixture. That's why my mother used to say she needed to wake the chocolate up. But there's one part of this technique that took me even longer to understand. It's not just any liquid. It's not just any amount. And you can't simply pour boiling water over the cocoa and expect the cake to turn out perfectly. Temperature matters. Proportion matters. And the moment when that mixture is added to the batter matters too. If you add too much liquid, you can completely change the structure of the cake. If you use too little, the cocoa won't hydrate the way it should. And if you simply mix everything together without understanding what's happening, you can end up with a cake that has plenty of flavor but is still dry. So, before I show you exactly how I do this step, it's worth understanding why it works. When you mix cocoa powder with a hot liquid, the first thing that happens is hydration. The cocoa particles absorb some of that liquid and disperse more effectively, creating a much more homogeneous mixture. This helps develop the chocolate flavor and prevents that sensation of the cocoa simply being thrown into the flour and left to distribute itself. But the real secret is understanding that cocoa isn't alone in this story. Think of the batter as a small system in which every ingredient has a function. Flour provides much of the structure. Eggs help bind the ingredients together and contribute to the structure as they bake. Fat directly affects the sensation of tenderness. Sugar isn't just there to sweeten the cake, it also influences the texture and helps retain moisture. And liquids are responsible for hydrating the dry ingredients and allowing the entire structure to form properly. And then we have cocoa. It adds flavor and color, but it also takes up some of the space that, in a lighter colored batter, would normally be occupied by flour. That's why simply adding more cocoa doesn't automatically mean you'll get a more chocolatey and better cake. You have to consider the balance between the ingredients. That's exactly why that little step from the old bakery made sense. We're not simply adding liquid to the cocoa. We're preparing the cocoa to work properly within the batter. And once you understand that, you realize something that completely changed the way I make cakes. Making a truly tender cake isn't simply about putting all the ingredients into a bowl and mixing them together. The order, the temperature, and the way you treat each ingredient before combining them can be just as important as the ingredients themselves. And now that you know why this trick works, we can finally make the cake exactly the way my mother taught me. Now I'll show you exactly how I make it. And I want you to pay particular attention to the first step, because that's precisely the part I ignored for so many years. For a 2-layer, 8-inch cake, I start with 3/4 cup of unsweetened cocoa powder. I place the cocoa in a bowl and add 1 cup of very hot water, stirring slowly until all the lumps disappear. Within a few seconds, That dry powder turns into a dark, smooth, glossy mixture. I set it aside for a few minutes while I prepare the rest of the batter. In another bowl, I combine 2 large eggs, 1½ cups of sugar, 1/2 cup of vegetable oil, and 1 teaspoon of vanilla extract. Then I add 1 cup of buttermilk and mix just until everything is evenly combined. The oil is important here because it helps maintain that tender texture even after the cake cools. Now I go back to the dry ingredients. In a larger bowl, I combine 1 3/4 cups of all-purpose flour, 1½ teaspoons of baking soda, and 1/2 teaspoon of salt. There's no need to beat or work this mixture. Just make sure everything is evenly distributed. Then comes the part I enjoy the most. I pour the warm cocoa mixture into the liquid ingredients and stir until everything is evenly combined. Then I begin gradually incorporating the dry ingredients. And here's one rule I've learned to respect. Stop mixing as soon as the flour disappears. Don't try to make the batter perfectly smooth by beating it for several more minutes. The more you work a flour-based batter, the greater the chance of developing a firmer structure than we want. For a tender cake, we don't need a heavily worked batter. We need a well-incorporated one. The final batter should be relatively thin and uniform, much more fluid than the heavy cake batter many people are used to seeing. For the pans, I grease 2 8-inch round cake pans and line the bottoms with parchment paper. I divide the batter evenly between the 2 pans and give them just a gentle tap against the countertop to release any large air bubbles. While I'm preparing everything, the oven is already preheated to 350 degrees Fahrenheit, or approximately 175 degrees Celsius. The pans go into the oven for about 28 to 34 minutes, but I don't rely solely on the clock. The baking time can vary depending on the oven and the size of the pans. The center should be set but still tender, and a toothpick inserted into the middle should come out with a few moist crumbs, not completely covered in wet batter. And here's one of the things that took me the longest to learn. Don't wait for the cake to look completely dry before taking it out of the oven. I remove the pans and let the cakes rest for about 10 minutes before turning them out. They're still finishing, setting on the inside as they cool. After that, I let them cool completely before adding the frosting. That's how you get the texture we're looking for. Not a wet or heavy cake, but a soft, moist chocolate cake with enough structure to hold a slice without falling apart. And if you think following these steps is enough to guarantee the result, there's a problem. There are at least 5 very common mistakes that can ruin this texture, even when the recipe itself is correct. The first is probably the most obvious, but also one of the most common: overbaking. I used to think that a few extra minutes wouldn't make a difference. They do. When you leave the cake in the oven waiting for that toothpick to come out completely clean and dry, you've often already gone past the ideal point. You don't want a toothpick covered in raw batter, but a few moist crumbs are exactly what you're looking for. The second mistake happens before the cake even goes into the oven, using too much flour. This happens much more easily than you might think. If you dip the measuring cup directly into the bag of flour and pack it down, you can end up adding significantly more flour than the recipe intended. More flour means a more structured batter and less room for moisture. For a delicate recipe like this, measuring correctly makes a difference. The third mistake is over-mixing the batter. Once the flour goes in, we're not trying to beat the batter until it becomes perfect. We're simply incorporating the ingredients. The more you work the flour, the more gluten you develop. And an overly developed structure can turn that soft cake into something firmer and heavier. The fourth mistake brings us back to the secret from the old bakery: adding dry cocoa directly to the batter and expecting it to do all the work on its own. When you hydrate the cocoa first with a hot liquid, it disperses much more evenly and develops a deeper chocolate flavor. It's a simple step, but it's exactly the kind of detail that has disappeared from many modern recipes. And the fifth mistake is one of the trickiest: waiting for the cake to become completely firm before taking it out of the oven. When you look at the center and think, It still looks a little soft. That doesn't necessarily mean it's undercooked. The cake continues cooking from the heat it has already absorbed even after it comes out of the oven. If you wait for it to look completely done while it's still in the oven, you may discover too late that you've already passed that perfect point of tenderness. That's how I learned the difference between a cake that is simply cooked and a cake that is cooked to exactly the right point. And when you put all 5 things together, measuring correctly, hydrating the cocoa, not overworking the batter, controlling the baking time, and taking the cake out at the right moment, something happens that you notice immediately when you cut that first slice. When the cake finally cools, the part I enjoy the most arrives, cutting the first slice. I place the knife right in the center and press down slowly. The difference is immediate. Instead of the cake breaking apart and leaving a pile of dry crumbs on the plate, the knife moves through the cake with almost no resistance. The slice stays intact, and when you look at the center, you can see that fine, even texture we've been looking for from the very beginning. This is the moment when you understand why that small step with the cocoa matters so much. A chocolate cake made without this extra care may have a beautiful color and a strong flavor, but the texture is often drier, heavier, and more crumbly. You end up relying on frosting, milk, or a scoop of ice cream to compensate for what was missing from the cake itself. Here, the story is different. The chocolate is present from the very first bite. The cake is soft, moist without being heavy, and firm enough to hold its structure. And when you press the slice with a fork, it slowly springs back instead of simply falling apart. I still remember the first time I made it exactly the way my mother had learned. I cut a slice, tasted it, and immediately understood why she had never abandoned that little step. It wasn't a trick for turning a bad cake into a good one. It was simply a way of allowing the ingredients to do their job better. And perhaps that's the best proof of all. You don't need a complicated comparison. Just cut a slice from a cake made the old-fashioned way and pay attention to what happens with the knife. And maybe you're thinking that getting this result requires a professional kitchen, special equipment, or ingredients that you can only find at an old-fashioned bakery. It doesn't. This cake was made in an ordinary kitchen with a bowl, a cake pan, a household oven, and ingredients you can probably find at any supermarket. I didn't need a professional machine, a boxed mix, or some secret ingredient that cost a fortune. And that's exactly what I love about these old-fashioned techniques. For a long time, we started believing that to make truly good food at home, we needed to buy more things, better equipment, more expensive ingredients, specialized products. But many of the best techniques I've learned didn't come from a store. They came from people who learned to understand what they were doing. My mother didn't have any special equipment to make that cake tender. She simply knew that the cocoa needed to be treated a certain way before it went into the batter. And that's a huge difference. The secret wasn't buying better ingredients. It was understanding the ingredients she already had. That's why I still love these old recipes. They don't try to hide the technique behind a long list of ingredients. They teach small details that help ordinary ingredients work better. And sometimes, all we need to improve a recipe we've been making for years is to bring back one of those little details that someone stopped teaching. Maybe that's why some of the cakes our mothers and grandmothers made seemed so different. Not because they had secret ingredients, but because they knew small techniques that hardly anyone teaches anymore. My mother learned this one from someone older, and for years I made this cake without even understanding why she went through that extra step with the cocoa. Today, whenever I see an old handwritten recipe, I think about exactly that. How many little secrets are still hidden in those old kitchens, waiting for someone to bring them back? So, the next time you make a chocolate cake, don't simply add the cocoa straight to the batter. Give it a little hot liquid first, and let this small technique do the work that old-fashioned bakers already understood. And if your mother or grandmother had a kitchen trick that you've never found in a modern recipe, tell us about it in the comments. Maybe the next secret we bring back came from your family. because there's another old-fashioned technique that can turn an ordinary cake into something incredibly tender, and almost nobody uses it anymore.